As the war in Syria winds down, talks are being held to determine which countries will bear the burden of paying for and aiding reconstruction efforts. But in order to determine what is needed in Syria, we must first take a look at how the country has been devastated by this war. RT's Rachel Blevins has the story.
The cost of reconstruction in Syria will be excruciatingly high, but even though a number of countries are responsible for the destruction, they are not nearly as eager to fund the country's restoration. The World Bank recently announced that it does not plan to participate in rebuilding Syria. This comes after the United States announced earlier this year that it was pulling funding from reconstruction efforts in the country. Instead, the U.S. said it will rely on other countries to provide more than $230 million in funds. But estimates from the United Nations indicate that the cost of rebuilding Syria will actually be much higher. The total is actually around $388 billion in economic damage. This includes $120 billion in destruction to roads, homes, and infrastructure, and $268 billion in lost productivity, which has impacted the country's GDP. Nearly 500,000 Syrians have been killed since the war began, and more than 11 million have been displaced from their homes. The devastating impact this war will have on the country will continue for years to come. This reality is heartbreaking to many who knew Syria before the war. It was a country known for its history and its culture. One former toured guide described it by writing, quote, "Syria's beautiful heritage sites are a testimony to different cultures and civilizations that went before us. They include some of the country's oldest and most prestigious sites, which were built and preserved by people and empires over centuries." While Damascus and Aleppo were once considered World Heritage Sites by the United Nations, they have since been reduced to rubble. While the buildings can be rebuilt, it does not change the fact that a wealth of history was lost in this war. The country once relied on agriculture and oil to fuel its economy, but because of the war, many of the fields have either been destroyed or are still not under government control. So when discussing the idea of going to war with Iraq, former Secretary of State Colin Powell claimed that he told President Bush, quote, "Once you break it, you are going to own it." The United States is responsible for destabilizing the region, arming and training so-called rebel groups, and bombing and displacing innocent civilians, all in a quest to illegally overthrow a foreign government. But while there are many ways in which the U.S. can be credited with breaking Syria, it does not appear that it will be nearly as quick to rebuild it. In Washington, Rachel Blevins, RT.
The Syrian government is calling for an investigation into U.S.-led coalition crimes. Just this weekend, airstrikes in the eastern town of Hajin, near the Iraqi border, killed 26 civilians, mostly women and children. The Syrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs wrote a letter to the United Nations Secretary General and the UN Security Council claiming that the United States has no respect whatsoever for the lives of innocent people and the international law. The letter further stated that the U.S. is in blatant violation of all UN Security Council resolutions on Syria. And whilst the United States and its allies continue to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity, the Security Council has maintained an awkward silence and failed to take any measure to stop those misdeeds. For more on Syria, former senior security policy analyst in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Michael Maloof, joins me. Michael, thank you so much for being here.
Sure, pleasure.
I want to start with the U.S. role in Syria. Now, we're not technically at war with Syria, yet the United States has pushed for a continued presence. Trump has made multiple comments about bringing his troops back home, but has also talked about expanding. What's the ultimate game here? What is the United States' role and mission really in Syria?
Well, it's trying to, the United States is trying to maintain some relevancy in its Middle East policy. And what they're occupying east of the Euphrates, which is about a third of Syria in the east, and in an effort basically to partition Syria. And this is what they're hoping to do, basically not only to control the oil, but also to stop Iran from having access from Tehran to the Mediterranean. So even though the United States has not been invited there, it's still insisting upon a role in the Kurdish-controlled regions, which, of course, is going to pose problems for NATO fellow member Turkey.
Right. Well, we've seen so many casualties. As Rachel said earlier, there are billions in economic damage to the country, from infrastructure to productivity, and the billions lost in Syria's GDP. But who's ultimately going to be involved with the reconstruction? The Trump administration is drafting a strategy to impose sanctions against Russia and Iranian companies planning to help with this post-reconstruction. But who ends up picking up the cost for these billions of dollars in damages?
Well, that is the big issue. And since the United States has decided to pull out and withdraw funds that it had already committed, Russia is actually controlling reconstruction in Syria right now through Jaime Mimera base and its reconciliation portion of the base. I'm hearing unconfirmed reports that countries of the GCC, the Gulf Arab countries, are thinking of reestablishing diplomatic relations with Syria in an effort to not only legitimize Assad, but to ultimately to try to wean or even drive a wedge between Syria and Iran. So there's a caveat here. There's a strategy on the part of these countries, particularly the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia.
Do you really think that Assad would agree to allow the Saudis and the UAE, who helped play a part in the destruction, to help in the reconstruction? Well,
I think so, because, but it doesn't mean that he's going to live up to the end of the idea that they have of pulling away from Iran. Assad has already committed that China, Russia, and Iran would have priority in any reconstruction. But Iran, of course, is having its own economic issues right now. And so if these countries come in, it would give a diplomatic recognition that Assad is there to stay as the leader of Syria, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to commit to abandoning his relationship with Iran.
And there's word on China contributing as well, one of those biggest nations.
Yes, there is some, but you know, they too have economic issues. But there is more of a quiet development on the part of China. China is sort of the secret country involved in all this. They're very discreet and very quiet, but they are involved and they are very much involved.
Well, we'll see who will contribute to the billions. No one country can do it alone.
No.
Former Pentagon official Michael Maloof, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.